I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Amber Duke.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So today, obviously, just three of us. Ben is sadly very ill, so he won't be joining us, but it'll just be me, Inez, and Amber talking through the issues of the day, of which there are plenty. Inez is going to kick us off by talking about the election night, first focusing on the New York mayor's race. Amber's going to pivot then to talking about what happened in Virginia and New Jersey. We're back to Inez to kick us off on a discussion of Arctic frost and all that's been revealed there. And then finally, I will be talking about all the drama vis-a-vis Tucker and Fuentes and Kevin Roberts that's happened in the past week or so that's been seizing up on right-wing Twitter. So with that, straight to Inez.
Thanks, Will. So we had a not great night, as everyone knows, on Tuesday. But I'll focus on the New York City mayoral race. We've talked about this a bunch of times before. It's almost hashed out at this point. I actually don't think this result is as cataclysmic for New York as it is, I think, for the direction of the Democratic Party in a certain sense. And I'll explain why I think that in a minute. But the first part of it is that Mondami managed to scrape by. He got just over 50% of a very large turnout vote. So he got just over 1 million votes. So did not Mondami, right? So between Curtis Sliwa and Andrew Cuomo also got nearly 1 million votes, which, by the way, is Andrew Cuomo got more votes than Eric Adams won with. So this is the result of a very high turnout election, a lot of energy among young people, but also a lot of energy among, let's call them traditional Democrats who came out for Andrew Cuomo, despite him running just the most horrendous campaign I've ever seen in my life. Really puts to rest the notion that the establishment of the parties knows anything about how to run a campaign or how to win a campaign. This campaign had more money than God. Obviously, Bill Ackman was extremely active in this campaign. I think there were other billionaires who did not want Mondami for eat the rich reasons. They know that they're on the menu. So they bankrolled this. They were trying to work out initially between the three candidates that were not Mondami, right? Sliwa, who is the Republican candidate who won fair and square his primary and has run before. Then Cuomo, who lost his primary and decided he's going to run as an independent, and then Eric Adams, who also decided to run for re-election as an independent. I personally think they made a big mistake, even though Adams was polling lower. I think he had more of a coalition. I think he did know how to win in New York. I think he probably would have had a better shot than Cuomo. Right off the bat, Cuomo was very hated by almost everyone for very, very good reasons. He's hated by the left because he's the quintessential establishment Democrat who was forced out for Me Too reasons. I think that was all internal machinations to prevent him, honestly, from having to essentially stand in and stand trial for the decisions that he made during COVID with regard to nursing homes, decisions that other Democrats, for example, across the river in New Jersey, also made. So I tend to think the Me Too allegations more often than not within the Democratic Party are just behind the scenes ways of getting out somebody that the Democratic Party has found inconvenient for them at that moment for whatever reason. I think that's what happened to Andrew Cuomo. But nevertheless, he could not give it up. He decided to stay in, and eventually Adams dropped out, gave him that independent lane. Then the blame game came for Curtis Sliwa, who, again, won his primary fair and square, has run as a Republican over and over again in New York. He's a bit of a New York celebrity. He's a funny guy. I like him. He's sort of an eccentric, but he's also a perennial loser. So in any case, then there was the blame game to say that, if you vote for Curtis Sliwa, you're letting Mondami win. Well, apparently that's not true because Mondami did squeak out the 50%. He would have won no matter what. And I think it's very unfair to blame Republicans for not voting for Cuomo, who did not campaign. I didn't get a single touch from the Cuomo campaign as somebody who voted for Sliwa last time, did not get a single text, got some PAC stuff, but did not get anything from their actual campaign. Have never seen a canvasser or Andrew Cuomo seen canvassers and gotten texts from both other campaigns. Dave Marcus did some great on the ground reporting showing that Cuomo did not visit Republican areas of New York, neighborhoods like Bay Ridge, really basic retail politics. He failed. And finally, he couldn't attack Mondami on the most salient issue, the issue that all polls show that he has had the biggest weakness on, and that was public safety and his comments about defunding the police. And the reason Andrew Cuomo couldn't really launch a very substantive attack on Mondami is that he actually, implemented a lot of the same policies as governor. In fact, his name is on the no bail reform law that is probably more responsible than anything the mayor does for the crime problems in New York City. That's the law responsible for the fact that people can have 23 felonies and go right back on the subway to punch somebody on the head. That's a reform law that Andrew Cuomo's name is on. He was the governor. He signed it. He, touted it. It's, by the way, a law that is unpopular, 55% to something like 29% in New York City, in blue New York City. Anyway, so all that mess got us where we are today. As Dave Marcus's column said, I think this is it is what it is. Election. Mondami is mayor. We'll see what he does. I think there is substantial room to counterbalance Mondami. I think there is a lot of there were obviously a lot of people in the city who turned out to vote against him and his policies for a wide variety of reasons. I think there is a lane there, both in the city, and now I think that possibly there is a lane to the governorship for Republicans and Elise Stefanik in New York, as crazy as that sounds. I think there's a lot of people in the state who really don't want to see this direction in the Democratic Party. And that's why I say he's more of a problem, actually, I think, for the National Democratic Party than he is reflective of something special about New York City. But I'm really curious what you guys think. We've hashed out who we think he is, and obviously we all dislike him, but what you think about this election or what it says nationally.
Yeah, I'll throw out just a few things that I find interesting. I mean, first of all, I totally agree that this is a big win for Elise Stefanik. She's already been polling fairly well in the gubernatorial race. Having Mamdani to run against as a foil, I think only helps her even more. In terms of campaign strategy, Mamdani actually did a very Trumpian thing in that he focused on people who had not voted before or people who were low propensity to mid propensity and really tried to get them out, which is why we saw turnout so much higher in this election than previous mayoral races. That's almost precisely what Trump did in 2024 and to an extent in his previous two campaigns. Was I want to get the disaffected voter who's really not happy with the leadership of every party and be their sort of champion. Looking at the exit polls, we've talked a lot on this show, particularly about how much of a misdirection it is to say that Mamdani's campaign was solely about affordability issues. But I think the people who actually voted for him really underscore that, because when you look at the breakdown of education, the level of education that voters have, Mamdani actually lost to Cuomo for anyone who has less than a college degree. So people from dropped out of high school to dropped out of college all went for Cuomo. It's only when you get bachelor degrees, PhD students, graduate students, et cetera, that actually voted majority with Mamdani. And then on the income level, Cuomo won people who earned fewer than $30,000 per year. Mamdani won the $30,000 to $300,000 range, and then Cuomo won the $300,000 plus. So this is the student debt coalition, basically. These are people who are overeducated, underemployed, and are resentful of the system because they feel like they did the right thing by going to college, and so they should be doing as well as all of the hedge fund managers, and they're not. They're maybe working as baristas or what have you. And so they want all of these utopian socialist promises because that's like retribution for them not getting a good use of their college degree. Is that like really the working class, like people who went to NYU and have to like bootstrap it as a bartender? I wouldn't really describe it that way. I mean, these are not like blue collar laborers. And so it's a very unique subset of people and very much in line with the idea of having privileged politics, right? Like if you're someone who actually does manual labor for a living and is paycheck to paycheck, you're not jazzed with the idea of a communist taking over your city. That's not actually what you want and what you think is going to make your life better. The people who support these pie in the sky progressive policies are people who have been really indoctrinated by the education system and haven't made enough money yet to feel like they got what they were promised from their piece of paper that they got from their university.
Yeah, I think that in many ways the people are reading too much into Mamdani's success as saying, this is now the way to win in elections. And like, this is what motivates people. I mean, New York City should be going to the Democrat nominee every time, right? New York City is a heavily Democratic city. I don't know how much it went for Trump, but something like 75-25, 80-20 did New York City proper go for Trump. It's a huge number. This is a deeply, deeply blue city. And yet Mamdani, who was running with the Democratic Party imprimatur, won 50% of the vote. And he managed to get 1 million non-Mamdani votes out there. That's a huge number in a city like New York. So I think that, congratulations to Mamdani. And I don't think it's good for the city of New York. I don't think it's good for New Yorkers. But the model that Mamdani is using, this sort of third worldist socialism, it's going to work in cities like New York. But I mean, it will be able to run against it. And I think it's clearly not broadly popular. Like if you can only get half in New York City as running as a Democrat, it's not going to do better elsewhere. I don't have a lot of time for the people blaming Sliwa for being a spoiler. He was the Republican nominee. He's a major party nominee. He gets to run. The major party doesn't have the obligation to abdicate its vote and to abdicate its place in these elections. If the Democrats believed it was so important to knock off Mamdani that they needed to, run an independent, well, then maybe they should have, gone ahead and endorsed Sliwa. What was the problem? Maybe they said, oh, well, Sliwa can't win. Well, it's like, what if you all endorsed him? What if you all decided to put, instead of put your head going? And I think that people should have actually been willing to do that. So I don't have much time there. I think, but everything else has been covered. Obviously, I don't think it's going to be good for New York City. That said, the Manhattan Institute did a good job, put out an article explaining why there's not a lot he'll be able to do. But I think the big takeaway, I think, is that actually, and it's the one I don't see very often, which is this is not a platform or not a model for the way elections are going to work in the rest of the country. And I hope Democrats try and adopt it because we'll crush them if they do. Moving on, we'll move to Virginia and New Jersey, which actually those are much scarier places for Republicans, as I think Amber will explain.
Yeah, I'll talk more probably about Virginia than New Jersey, and leave that one for y'all, but just because I live in Virginia, so I was very close to this race. I think there's plenty of reasons to not be blackpilled about what happened in Virginia. One of which is that Virginia historically has gone the opposite partisan direction of the president in like all but one gubernatorial election in the past 70 years. So just historically, trend-wise, this is not abnormal. Second is that we are in the middle of a government shutdown. Northern Virginia, which is the most highly motivated voters, a lot of them are out of work or have lost government contracts or their jobs have been cut by the Trump administration. So they're just really pissed off right now. They don't want to vote for Republicans because they are out of work. And the third reason is that I don't think Winsome Sears was a great candidate. Everyone in Virginia GOP politics kind of acknowledged this. Virginia's at least in Northern Virginia, where most of the vote is concentrated, they don't like Republicans that come off like a little too right-wing or a little kooky, and Winsome just comes across that way. And obviously that's fine for me and for Republicans, but for people who are more of like a center left, she's not the type of candidate that's really going to motivate them to vote against their own party. And I don't think she ran a really great campaign. She didn't talk much about the economy. We literally just got, everyone in Virginia, taxpayers got a $200 refund for individual filers, a $400 refund for households, like a month ago. And I don't recall seeing like a single ad where she capitalized on the fact that her administration has balanced the budget and given taxpayers back some of their money every single year since Youngkin took office. Instead, it was really heavily on the trans issue, which was huge in Virginia in 2021 because we were coming out of the pandemic and the school policies in particular were very salient on people's minds. but that doesn't really work so well during a shutdown and when the economy is the number one issue for voters. She didn't talk a ton about immigration either, which ended up being a top 4 issue. So even though voters that cared about immigration went for her, it wasn't a significant chunk of voters. It was only like 10% of people said that that was their top issue. I think highlighting the fact that Spanberger wants to not cooperate with ICE would have been somewhat helpful, but not as much as, again, cost of living, affordability, economy, all of those economic type issues. So for all of those reasons, it wasn't surprising that Winsome lost. Obviously, the final polling, the vote differential was much bigger than most people expected, and even the polls anticipated. People were thinking that the race might be within like 6 or 7 points. And that would be enough to potentially have Jay Jones, the attorney general, who was massively hurt by this scandal of calling for the death of his political opponents and watching their children die in their mother's arms. Winsome basically needed to keep the governor's race within 5 points in order for Jay Jones to lose, and that didn't happen. So the governor race, not surprising. Republicans didn't run a great campaign. The conditions were not good for them. I think the Jay Jones thing is a much bigger reason to be blackpilled. That 91% of Democrats said that they did not think his text messages were disqualifying. That out of all Virginia voters, not even a majority said that they were disqualifying. And perhaps most disturbingly, according to the exit polls, mothers, women with children went for Jones. The majority of women with children went for Jones after he said that he wanted political opponents' children to die. It's just, people just didn't care about it. And I don't think there was a way to make them care. I heard someone yesterday say something along the lines of, well, if they had just explained better that like he was going to be the top cop and him saying those things means that he couldn't treat people with partisan differences equally under the law, then that would have convinced people that this was a serious problem. I don't think that's it. I think Democrats just don't care. It's vote blue no matter who. That's where we're at now. So that was the most disturbing part of the Virginia election. New Jersey, it's kind of a similar story in that it was apparently about affordability issues. And Citarelli, I know, talked some about energy policy, but it sounds like Mikey Sherrill, based on people who have been who live in New Jersey or were talking about and covering the election, just really hammered that point home. So I don't think it's as concerning for the midterms just because we have a year for some of those economic conditions to change pretty significantly. But I think the fact that Republicans really overestimated how they would perform shows that they're pretty out of touch right now with how voters are feeling. And that's really where they kind of need a swift kick in the butt to make sure that they're prepared for 2026. But I'll let you guys weigh in on any other thoughts on those two races.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the last part that I think the right probably is out of touch on some of these issues with the electorate. That being said, I think this is a weakness that's going to endure in this coalition, which is when Trump's name is not on the ballot, Republicans underperform. And that's partially because the Republican Party is not nearly as popular as Donald Trump. But, long term, to me, this says problems ahead for 2028, for the future of the Republican Party, for reasons we'll get to for the rest of this podcast, but also because, we're being held together by the charisma and judgment of a single person. And that person does not have long coattails. It doesn't work that way. Even when he endorses someone, even when he comes out and campaigns for somebody, it just doesn't transfer. His charisma is non-transferable. And so I think that's something that the right is really going to struggle with, not only in off-year elections, not only in the midterms, but in a future where Donald Trump is not on the top of the ticket, which is funny because for so long we were told Donald Trump is dragging down the Republican Party, and the exact opposite is true. Donald Trump is propping up the Republican Party, and when he's not there, bad election results ensue. There is an interesting story in New Jersey and in New York, I think, potentially something hopeful for the Republican Party. I think there is movement among the so-called white ethnics of the Northeast as the composition of the party changes, as the issues change, as frankly the religious composition of the party changes. I think there's a lot of Italian, Polish, Irish type families in the New York and New Jersey area who don't seem very liberal when you talk to them, but they've been voting Democrat for 100 years. And I wonder if some of this movement in the polls and even not being, even this closer race in New Jersey is kind of surprising, right? New Jersey is deep blue. It's never been considered a swing state as for, in our political memory. And these polls for the governorship in New York, the fact that so many people came out to vote against Cuomo, even in New York City, I think there is potential for the same kind of shift that happened in the South, right? Where you had essentially a Democratic Party that was locally established for 100 years, sometimes with, sort of corrupt Tammany Hall type tactics, but had this very long history and this enormous loyalty among certain demographics, voting over and over and over again. And then once it started to tip, it became a flood. Once those families broke faith essentially with the Democratic Party, which in practice on issues they had not agreed with for a long time, it became a flood. And all of those people eventually, like what you're seeing, all of West Virginia that voted Democrat for 100 years is suddenly going to be completely red very soon. I think it's too soon to tell, but I think there might be something in the Northeast happening with the white ethnics in that regard, that they just don't fit in the modern Democratic Party. Their interests don't fit in the modern Democratic Party. They don't like the rhetoric of the modern Democratic Party. And they're Republican curious, let's say, and that Republican curiosity might well turn into a Republican alignment over time, which would change the map. It would change the map. So that's my little piece of hope, I guess. Regarding Virginia, I think it is a black pill that people will vote for a Democrat who says he wants to kill his opponent's children and was not joking and had multiple attempts to clarify and just kept doubling down. It's actually what he believes. And I don't know, it feels very much the same as watching professionals after Charlie's assassination come out and cheer for it, people that you're going to have to rely on to, I don't know, to be your child's pediatrician or to defile your tax documents or a million other things that you can't actually avoid in social life and in civic life. So I think that is a black pill. That being said, I think Virginia is a deep blue state. I think Youngkin was the aberration. I think it was a very strange brew of circumstances and issues immediately after the pandemic and the lockdowns and the like racial reckoning and the explosion in the schools and everything else. And I just, I wouldn't expect Virginia. I think Virginia is going to get more blue, not less, for a variety of reasons. One, the number of government workers. Now, maybe if we lay off a quarter of the federal government and they go elsewhere, that could change Virginia politics. But as long as those federal workers are there in Northern Virginia and they're high propensity voters, they come out and vote all the time and they vote for their interests, I just don't see Virginia being anything but a deep blue state.
Yeah. On Virginia, I think, and both in New Jersey, honestly, I think the big dynamic that people are forgetting is it's the off-year election, the immediately after a presidential election, is one where the party out of power has a huge advantage. Their people are angry and frustrated and motivated to go to the polls. The people who won are happy and content and sort of just kind of doing their own thing. So their low propensity voters don't get out. This is, I mean, Jack Ciattarelli ran 4 years ago against probably a similar candidate. I think Murphy was an incumbent at that point, and Ciattarelli got within 4. And now Ciattarelli, same candidate 4 years later, but it's a different environment. Trump's the president. Now suddenly he loses by more, 15 or something. Similarly in Virginia, you had Youngkin somehow. Biden had won by 14 the year before. Youngkin swung at 16 points in the other direction. Off year election where you're motivated, and I think vice versa. And I think we were all a little delusional about what was going to happen here. We thought that the Jay Jones stuff would be more impactful than it was. It was impactful enough that, I don't know, swung the election something like 6 or 7 points. Maybe 6 or 7% of the public decided to affirmatively not vote for Spanberger and vote for Jones instead. A lot of ticket splitting, but it still wasn't enough. It's depressing to realize that half of Virginians are perfectly happy or the people who vote, half the people who voted are perfectly happy to vote for a candidate who wants to kill my kids. I don't think that's an understatement. I think that's, I'm a Republican. We're all of our kids. We're all Republican influencers. The guy would be perfectly happy killing our children. I think it's ridiculous to even say that, but that's where we are. And he's the top cop in Virginia. So that's a very, very distressing and disturbing thing. But I think it's just a reminder. I think people are trying to read a little bit too much into these, like the affordability thing. I hear that, but the affordability, that's a reason to maybe taper back on some of the tariffs, especially ones that aren't doing a good job protecting domestic industries, try and reduce the cost of living somewhat. But this is more of a mobilization election. I think that the Democrat base is just fundamentally more mobilized right now. The Republicans are happy and chilling at home, and their people are in power. So, all right, transition now. Let's go to Arctic frost.
Yeah, wish we had Ben for this one. Just an astonishing story that is not getting play. And I think, as we talked a couple of weeks ago about, as these revelations started to come out, about what exactly the federal government was doing with regard to its political opponents under Biden, we're all sort of out of shock and outrage because we've said it so many times and how dangerous it is. And what a Rubicon crossing thing this is. But the details are still shocking, and they're still worth going over and being outraged about all over again. I think, honestly, we are a victim of our own cynicism and developed a sort of blasé attitude towards this, but we really ought not to. So at least 8 Republican senators were under surveillance. No suggestion that any of them committed a crime for that to happen. They had their phones tapped, they had their communications tapped. I mentioned in previous revelations, and when we talked about other aspects of this op, there were federal marshals tapped to basically sit behind them on airplanes instead of watching out for terrorists who might be bum rushing the cockpit of an airplane. This is a 9/11 program. Those marshals were tapped to sit behind Republican senators and note when they went to the bathroom and to try to see what they were saying on their phones. So Smith issued 197 subpoenas to 430 individuals and organizations. Basically, all of the professional right was under subpoena. If your organization in DC was not under subpoena, you might not have been doing that much. But it really, basically all of the professional right was under subpoena or surveillance. Most of this had absolutely nothing to do with January 6th, which was the ostensible reason for this operation. Some of those organizations had not even started or done any of their operations until after January 6, 2021. So they literally did not exist when the central event happened, and yet they were still under surveillance. Then there is Judge Boasberg, who apparently he gave Smith permission to force to gag the phone companies from telling these people that they were under surveillance, to prevent them from finding out that they were under surveillance. And basically the subpoenas you could imagine maybe there's a far-ranging investigation, but they're looking for something extremely specific. That's not what happened. They subpoenaed everything from these organizations, their donors, their internal emails, right? Their strategic communications. This is Watergate times a million. What was Watergate? Trying to break in to get some, documents and strategic things in a Democratic office. This basically used the power of the federal government, not 2 guys entering at night, but the power of the federal government and the agencies that are supposed to be protecting Americans, keeping us safe from terrorism abroad and from, criminal organized crime at home, were surveilling and subpoenaing all of the strategic documents of their political opponents and putting them through the ringer in terms. And make no mistake, if we had lost this 2024 election, they would start putting people in jail for being their political opponents. That's what the prep work, that's what this prep work is for. We know that they went after President Trump. They know that they've gone after their political enemies in this way. This is the prep work for lawfare against the broader conservative movement for being conservative. That's what this is. Nobody should imagine that it's anything different, or frankly, imagine that if we lose a national election, that all of this won't start back up tomorrow. And open for comment, I guess.
Yeah. I think it really is brazen what Jack Smith tried to do here. I mean, not just the subpoenas of all these Republican senators, but the demand that going to a court and getting a court order, keeping those subpoenas secret because the people who got them might reveal the existence of the investigation or violate their legal obligations. I mean, it's a profound insult to a co-equal branch of government to say that, because what you're saying is Ted Cruz is going to violate his ethical obligations and court orders in order to release this information to the public, and he wouldn't do that. Ted's a member of the bar in good standing. I mean, he's argued before the Supreme Court, so it's deeply insulting, and I think it's going to have a real long-lasting impact. The impeachment push against Judge Boasberg is real. That's happening. Senators want it to happen. Now, I don't think we have the votes in the Senate, but the fact is that there's enormous anger among Republicans senators, justifiably so. I mean, because it's not just anybody and their mother getting a subpoena. It's a co-equal branch of government. There's a whole bunch, many of the rules that Congress writes that apply to executive branch employees don't apply to Congress. There's no FOIA for congressional documents. Congress hasn't written statutes. And so for the executive to, on its own initiative, start subpoenaing congressional documents and congressional phone records without any real basis, just on a fishing expedition, is just a huge breach in the way that things normally work in our government. And for Boasberg to approve of that, just be like, oh yeah, you can keep this secret from the Senate. I think there's not going to be getting around that. And obviously it's bigger than that too. I mean, it's all these heads of conservative organizations, but we know this is the ballgame. They want to put our people in jail. They treat, this is find the man and eventually we'll find the crime. It's just what Letitia James did to Donald Trump, magnified to the entire conservative movement. And hopefully we see some real accountability. And I think it starts obviously with, Boasberg. I think Boasberg's going to get impeached. I don't think he'll get convicted or removed from office, but he's going to have to defend himself in a Senate trial. And the Republicans are not happy about it.
Oh, nor should they be. Just to throw in a little bit about the media coverage of this. We've talked before on this show about how little coverage it's receiving, even among really conservative media. And I think that's because just from my own perception of what's happening, I think conservative media is fatigued from how frequently the left engages in lawfare. I mean, just going back to Russiagate, there was obviously incessant coverage about that. And I think at a certain point you hear like, oh yeah, they're spying on more people. It's like, okay, well, what else is new? But in the mainstream media, the few places that have covered it have made this again about Trump going after his enemies or Republicans going after their political enemies because of the calls to impeach Boasberg or put people who sought the subpoenas and the warrants in jail. And it's truly incredible just the amount of gaslighting from the liberal media where the left can collect phone records of its political enemies without any proper legal process, without any suggestion that any of these people had committed a crime. And if you react to it and say, oh, that's not right, all of a sudden the right's the one going after their political enemies. It's just truly incredible manipulation of the public.
All right. Well, I think we can make that one a shorter one. I think that's the one where we're really missing Ben, honestly, who's the expert on all matters Democrat lawfare. But anyway, we will move on to all the shenanigans with Tucker and Fuentes and everything. So obviously last week, in the run-up to the election, Tucker Carlson dropped an interview with Nick Fuentes. The interview itself was really quite embarrassing. It was embarrassing not just because Tucker failed to ask any meaningfully hostile questions of Fuentes at all, despite Fuentes having repeatedly insulted not merely Tucker himself personally and his wife, but also numbers of friends of Tucker, including people like Charlie Kirk and J.D. Vance. But Tucker took the opportunity to do something really obnoxious, which was to say how much, I think the most notable quotation from that was talking about how he despised, quote unquote, Christian Zionists. And that he thought they were the worst people in the world, that they angered him as much as anybody in the world. This was really not just, saying that alone would have been enough. Saying that while just having this buddy interview with like a really noxious and prominent anti-Semite was, I think, too much for a lot of people to stomach. So he got a lot of really ferocious criticism for it online. And I assume probably the director of Heritage, Kevin Roberts, heard some of this criticism and was getting angry and put out a statement. Exactly how the statement came to be is unclear, but he put out a statement coming to the defense of Tucker, and much of it was unobjectionable in the sense of talking about, the general being against cancel culture and the importance of loyalty and the fact that it's like, okay, obviously, and that critique of Israel is obviously permissible on the right and for Christians, like, yeah, that's all unobjectionable and kind of anodyne at the moment. But the real obnoxious thing was that he suggested that the people who were upset about what Tucker had said and were very critical of it made up a venomous coalition that was sowing division within the party. That was a really aggressive statement. And I wrote a post about that a week ago, talking about that was particularly the wrong thing to say, because if, the idea that everybody who disagrees with you disagrees with Tucker for hosting a really awful anti-Semitist program is being venomous and sowing division. It's like, well, they're the people who've been provoked. Like, can we think of a more divisive thing you could do in the run up to election than bring on somebody like Fuentes and have a softball interview with him? That, puts a split down the right and really creates a lot of tension. And moreover, Fuentes' views are obnoxious, obviously. Like, it's perfectly reasonable. And he's also not even in the tent. That guy was a Kamala supporter in 2024. So anyway, Kevin has now been dealing with a whole bunch of pushback and righteous pushback from the right, in my view. And recently put out a statement yesterday that was, I think, much more sensible. But it's created a lot of drama on the right and a lot of people having various positions and disagreeing with each other. I think that the biggest red herring to me is suggesting that this is about Israel when it really isn't. The thing about everybody agrees that Fuentes is not noxious, at least everybody relevant on our side. And so then the problem with Tucker interviewing him that way is like, okay, well then you're not only interviewing this guy and giving him a softball interview to kind of launder his views to the public, but you're also talking about yourself. I'm a Judeo-Christian Zionist. And then Robert's dealing with that by saying everybody upset with that was a venomous coalition. It's like Fuentes is the MacGuffin that everybody's acting upon. And it's the story of how you are acted upon that makes it makes it salient and relevant to people. I want to go back to forgetting about the guy. I actually word mute Fuentes, so because I don't think that he's important enough to discuss as a general principle. But I'd also like people. I think it's useful that it happened because I think for months now we've had there hasn't been real pushback against some of like this kind of overt obsession with anti-Israel politics, right? Like I actually talked with some friends about this. Tucker went on Dave Smith at the end of this, to defend himself. And I thought that was very appropriate because Dave Smith is basically a single issue advocate at this point. Like his only position that he cares about is anti-Israel. And it's like, to me, these people are not meaningfully distinguishable from like the British Islamist MPs who ran on lend your vote to Gaza. It's like they're totally solely focused on anti-Israel politics. It's like the defining part of it. I don't think Israel should be that important, but I also recognize that like you can't just insult Christian Zionists. That's like half the coalition. Well, this isn't just about Jews. Christians who think that are pro-Israel, that's like probably the majority of the party. And if not the majority, then a very, very strong plurality. So maybe we need to stop doing divisive things and don't just call out the people who've been provoked for being divisive when you've been doing the divisive thing in the first instance. I don't know. I think, I think this didn't help in the run up to the election. Certainly took everybody's eye off the ball. I think it really upset a lot of people. And hopefully we can I don't know what your guys' thoughts on it. I thought, I think Kevin did a good job cleaning up his statement. Really wish Tucker would just stop being an obnoxious asshole to half the coalition, but it seems like he just rather would not be in the 10.
Yeah, I think the problem is Tucker and not Fuentes, right? I think actually Nick Fuentes is very upfront about what he believes. Actually, the interview with Tucker was an exercise in obfuscation more than anything else. It made him sound, pretty bad, but maybe he did profess loyalty to Stalin, but like, it made him sound like on the outer skirts of our politics, when in fact he's beyond that, and he's made it clear many times. And that was through the artful direction of Tucker. And I'm all for debate. I agree with what Kevin Roberts said subsequently, that these ideas have to be confronted and not gatekept, not canceled, which is honestly a very like annoying and insulting canard and almost wiggly and dishonest from the people who use it. Nobody's talking about canceling Tucker. As far as I know, not a single conservative has called for him to be debanked or, locked up in a room, or even, and this is where I will say some people say this, I don't even care who remain. I understand that he has personal friends and that he's engendered a lot of loyalty with positions that he's taken for years for the conservative movement. I'm interested in ideas and clarity over the ideas. When Tucker brings on people to lie and say things that are not true, and for example, this Stephanopoulos' sister, right, who said that Israel is going to blow up the Temple Mount, that is not true, right? When he continually directionally engages in this weird neo-Chomskyite project where the enemies of America must have a point because our institutions, and we just talked about this in the last segment, our institutions have tipped over sometimes into being evil, that our global enemies must all have a point, like Russia must have a point, Iran must have a point, and all of the leaders of those people should get more softball interviews, and the only person deserving of pushback, which Tucker is capable of doing because he did it to Ted Cruz, right? And he is capable of issuing moral condemnation because he did it to, as Will said, half the Republican coalition. So I frankly think Tucker is dishonest. I think his project is anti-American at this point. I do think that he has a bug in his brain about the Jews and is going down that rabbit hole to the exclusion of all of his other politics, right? Like, this morning, he sent out a letter in a weird horseshoe effect praising woke Jews, the tiny percentage of Jews in New York City who voted for Zoran Mandami, because that's the kind of coalition that he's looking to build. Again, to me, I'm interested in the clarity of the ideas. I was one of the people very disappointed with the video that Kevin Roberts put out, not least because they are the flagship of the institutional right. And they represent what is getting institutionalized on the right. I also think the video he put out today was actually what I was looking for from him. After all of that, whatever struggle sessions and flip-flopping and sort of putting out successive statements and walking them back. And obviously all of that is very embarrassing. And I want to say that I'm speaking here only for myself. But what he said today, I think he's landed finally on the correct way forward, which is we should vigorously debate ideas. I think, frankly, that none of this noxious stuff can be gate kept. I think that's the consequence of living through the era that we have, where the gatekeepers have so completely abandoned their responsibility to truth and responsible discourse that we can't have a responsible discourse anymore. You can't make appeals to authority. You can't make appeals to moral outrage. You can't make appeals. So those things land flat for people. They want you to actually answer with point-by-point refutation. And I'll give a couple examples of people I think who have done that really well. And I think what I'm going to try to do going forward. So after Daryl Cooper went on Tucker and gave a completely revisionist take on World War II, wherein Churchill was the great villain of the whole shebang, imagine thinking about the continent at that point with both Hitler and Stalin on the continent and thinking that Churchill was really the great villain of World War II. But lay that aside. Victor Davis Hanson, who is a very serious World War II historian, went through point by point and said each one of Daryl Cooper's points is incorrect. He called him a crank, but he also went through an argument. And then on a smaller point today on the moon landing, apparently Kim Kardashian doesn't believe that the moon landing happened. There was somebody who went point by point through, well, the flag doesn't wave in the wind. Well, here's why the flag was moving. They had these wires, here you can see them in the video. This feels very stupid and very insulting for some people to have to do this. But frankly, I think it's the moment we're in. So I don't have a problem. I don't like the notion of platforming. I don't like the notion that you can't talk to somebody because you strongly disagree with them. But you need to strongly disagree with them. You can't just have them on and fluff them. If you want to have that debate, let's have that debate. And I think it would be very, very salutary, frankly, for the right, and maybe NatCon can do this, maybe somebody else can do this, to have a debate on Israel policy that does not descend into, Jewish conspiracy theories on the one hand and a reversion to tropes from the Bush era that people don't believe in anymore. I think it would be a very salutary thing to have a national interest debate about whether or not this is a good alliance. But I do agree with Will when he said that that's beside the point. I think I would like to see from conservative organizations in this moment, when Tucker says X, I want them to say, we don't believe in X. Because increasingly the things that come from that show are things that I don't believe, and I'm going to continue to say that I don't believe them. So yeah, that's where I landed. But obviously, one more thing on this. This really shows how we needed Charlie after he died. The episode that we did, I said, I don't know that all of this, like, yes, it's very nice and it's heartwarming to think about thousands of people rising up and replacing, sort of all the TV USA chapters exploding and moving forward in Charlie's project. I actually think he was a very unique talent, and his unique talent was seaming together all these people behind the scenes and navigating a line between them that excluded what needed to be excluded from the conservative movement, but also left room for people, a larger group of people who, for example, don't think that the American-Israeli alliance is a good national interest of America. I think Charlie did that really well. I don't know that we have someone to do that now. And I think this is going to keep happening. I don't think this is going to stop with this particular Heritage Foundation thing. I'm satisfied with what Kevin Roberts has done with this so far. I think he's done the best he can after putting out that really stupid statement. But I don't think this is going to stop here. And it may well tear the movement in half before 2028.
Yeah, so I'll start by saying when I found out that Nick Fuentes was going on Tucker's show, I was sort of actually looking forward to it because I thought it was going to be this really deep dive into his various statements that have been roundly condemned by the conservative movement and what he actually believes and how he got to where he is, and also his and Tucker's fight. And it was way fluffier than I imagined. I also think to an extent, it was a little bit more clarifying than people are giving it credit for. Having watched the portion specifically when Tucker is talking about the Christian idea that we do not believe in genetic sin, we don't believe that things are passed through blood. And he keeps pressing Fuentes on that point. And Fuentes is oh yeah, I agree. But also there's something unique about Jewry in America and the Jews, and they're always going to have loyalty to Israel, where he did actually admit, even as Tucker is trying to guide him through the Christian worldview on this and Christian principles, where he's no, but it's still the Jews. And so that was about as clear as you can get. But Tucker was exceptionally nice about it in a way that he hasn't been with other people on his podcast that he disagrees with. And that was where he, I think, missed the moment. On the heritage point, so obviously this started because Heritage had removed Tucker from its donor page or something along those lines. And at that point, there was speculation about what was going on. I didn't think that Kevin Roberts needed to say anything at that moment. And releasing the video just invited further division. It invited this conversation that shouldn't be happening anywhere but inside Heritage. So now all of a sudden you have this giant media firestorm, as well as the fight that's happening within Heritage. The video was done incredibly inartfully. Clearly was not workshopped well by Kevin and his team before it went out. And so then it just made people even more angry, and just turned into this massive internal and external, Heritage plus entire conservative movement, plus liberals dunking from the outside, just total chaos. And so he's trying to clean it up. There's leaks coming out of Heritage left and right, which if you're a leaker from a conservative organization, that's what the left does, right? That's what the New York Times does when the opinion page publishes an op-ed they don't is that they leak and they go to social media and they shit talk their own organization, pardon my language. And it's just not a good look for the conservative movement to be doing that. And then there was the page of recommendations of what Heritage can do to be less anti-Semitic or whatever, which I thought was also not a good look. The struggle session that I think Inez alluded to in a bit in her comments. And then ultimately we get to this place where Kevin sort of cleans up the statement and he releases something finally that really hits the tone that I think people were looking for. But everything in between those two videos, right, could have been avoided if he just hadn't said anything. And I think that would have been the wisest thing to do. but leading with the like very aggressive, like we're not going to be canceled thing, when there's a reason why Nick Fuentes is not mainstream in the conservative movement, just led to this really bizarre, like chaotic place. So those are my general feelings on the whole thing, but it just seems it was a very unnecessary and unfortunate distraction at a time when the conservative movement should have been focused on voter mobilization and messaging. And instead, we were all fighting with each other online. And I will say, to our credit, we do actually have these debates as opposed to the left, which is they have their coalitions and their divisions, but ultimately they don't really grapple with the really toxic forces in their universe. Whereas I think the right does do that better in terms of self-policing. So that's where I'll close.
Well, it's funny because the right for so long did too much self-policing, right? And right. I think that mode is making people's brains turn off. And here I'm not talking about bad faith actors, in which I personally include Tucker. I'm not talking about people who are coming at this with an axe to grind, or who genuinely coming at it from anti-Semitic perspective or whatever. I think people put their hackles up on the right now because the right finally, after decades, frankly, has learned that these spurious accusations that were hurled forever at the right about bigotry and Nazism and everything else, that the only way to withstand those things is to go tell people to pound sand, right? Mm-hmm. To say exactly what Kevin said about Tucker. The problem is that, one, the truth of the accusations and the actual substance. And two, the difference in consequence, right? We do have a problem if we can't have an actual fight about some of these substantive issues without somebody being like, when I'm being canceled. I mean, at that point, we don't have free speech either. If we don't have free speech, if everyone's too scared to say what they believe because they're worried about losing their job, we also don't have free speech if no one can be criticized because their ideas are just bad and untrue and in some cases noxious. So I don't like the entire cancellation frame. I think it has been completely misapplied here. I think we ought to be not the people who constantly fight the last war in terms of that framing of cancellation. Unfortunately, I don't think anyone has, to some extent, unfortunately, at least, I don't think anyone has the power to cancel anyone else at this point. That might be, a better situation than we had with the woke hegemony. But it's not a situation to envy where there are no lines because nobody has any trust in any institution and there's no line of civility or legitimately ideas that one wants to exclude from the mainstream public square. But for better or worse, that's the situation we're in. We can't do that. There's no ability to do that, how much anyone might want to. I just don't think that that's the direction that not just the right, but the country is going. I think it's generational. And I think we have to do that, quote unquote, do the work. I think we have to make the argument from scratch. I think that applies to Israel. Sadly, I think it applies to, Jews did 9/11, which is another thing that Tucker was winking at. I think we have to just push back and make the argument. I don't think there's any way around that. But I don't think that's cancellation. That is, in fact, called free speech.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Tucker is such a weird case because I think Tucker's earned so much grace from so many people because he did such good work for such a long time. He ran Tucker Carlson Tonight. It was the #1 show. And it's hard to just reconcile the Tucker that we're seeing now with the Tucker that we all grew to love and respect. And I think that's the hardest thing here. And so he also built a huge number of friendships. He has a lot of good relationships. He's done a lot of favors. He's been generous with this platform. I don't think he's a bad guy, but what he's doing and what he's obsessed with Israel. It's the #1 topic in his mind. I've noticed that it's every guest he brings on, he wants to talk about Israel. I remember there was one a couple weeks ago. I think he brought on Steve Bannon and they finally started talking about the left in this country. And I was like, this is such a better use of your energy. it's really a bummer. Anyway,
Ben and Jerry's guy that's been famous for those of us in the Bay Area for decades for being the most virulent socialist leftist Chomskyite possible. I don't know what he has in common with the right, other than he shares Tucker's obsession with Jews in Israel.
Right. He's willing to bring on the most diverse array of anti-Israel voices you've ever seen. It's just unbelievable. Anyway, so let's move on to final thoughts. Let's see what I was going to have. Well, I'll pass. I got distracted and forgot what my final thoughts.
I have a final thought. It's about the shutdown and nuking the filibuster, which we would have gotten to if we weren't having this inter-right struggle session. So I think Donald Trump is right about nuking the filibuster. I think it would be clarifying for politics in this country. I realize that it would swing law wildly back and forth according to elections, but I actually think that would be good for democracy in this country. It's a similar argument as I made about Dobbs. Yes, abortion is going to be a hot button issue now in our politics for a while. It may even be bad for the right on that in the electoral sense, but that is salutary for democracy. We need more responsiveness to American voters, because for too long we have had these issues that grow and fester orthogonal to our politics that never break through into either one of the parties. I think Donald Trump was very successful for that reason with regard to trade and immigration. But I think it would be healthy for us to actually have to bear the consequences of our votes. And I think nuking the filibuster will help with that. And that's a general case. That's a general case. In the specific case, I just think it's a game theory thing, and I absolutely think the left will nuke the filibuster, and we might as well get some good use out of it before they use it against us.
Yeah, I'll just double down and keep going off of yours. I think that's the right calculation. The general theme of, we shouldn't be afraid to do unprecedented things because Democrats do unprecedented things all the time. So whatever, they were going to exploit the press and the filibuster no matter what. Manchin and Stepman are gone. They're not going anywhere. We may not have the votes to do it, but it should just be the default position. And the other thing, this connects to another thought about the shutdown, which was, I think one of the pollsters made the point that I think one of the reasons we perform so much worse in the polling in New Jersey and Virginia is partially because of the shutdown. And we can say all we want about the fact that it really is the Senate Democrats' responsibility because they refuse to provide their votes, and the filibuster rule says 60 votes. But the average person doesn't understand that. They know that they're not getting their SNAP benefits, and they know that Trump is the president. So where do you go from there? And I think Democrats exploited that. I think that was part of their election strategy, was we're going to shut down the government and make people mad at the people who are nominally in charge of it. So given that, Republicans got to realize that the Democrats are unbelievably cynical. They'll get rid of the filibuster at the first opportunity, and they're just deciding to play with their hands behind their back for no particularly good reason.
My final thoughts are on an interview that Sydney Sweeney did with GQ, because it kind of goes back to what I was saying about you don't always have to lend your opinion on everything that happens. She was asked repeatedly about her infamous American Eagle jeans ad, and whoever gave her media training needs an immediate raise, because it's just hilarious. This GQ reporter keeps trying to bait her, and she gives her nothing. She asks oh, well, Trump tweeted about it. Wasn't that crazy? And Sydney's like, yeah, it was so surreal. And she replies are you worried about people getting an idea about your politics? And she says, no. And then she tries it for a third time, the reporter. And she says, well, people were saying that you were making a point about joking about white genetic superiority. Do you want to talk about that specifically? And she says, quote, I think that when I have an issue that I want to speak about, people will hear. So she just beautifully shuts her down 3 times in a row. And if she had given her even, I think, a little bit of meat to work with, it would not have been nearly as effective, no matter what she had said, whether she had apologized or doubled down. Instead, she's just yeah, I'm just not going to talk about it. And you can figure out what you want from that. You can interpret what you want. And it was just a masterclass in how, I think really how most Americans probably want their Hollywood celebrity cultural icon people to behave, which is just, we're going to make beautiful things. We're going to try to make good art. And sometimes it's going to fail. Sometimes it's going to succeed. But we're not going to sit here and like grovel and over explain ourselves to people when things don't land the way we want them to, or when people try to manipulate what we've done. And it was just awesome. I recommend everybody watch the interview.
Yeah, I thought that was super cool. Just I thought, and a brilliant piece of rhetoric that of a way of handling a journalist question. The like, her saying, "Oh, I'm giving you the floor to say something," and she's like, "When I have something to say, I'll let you know."
So like, badass.
Just like a complete, the most polite, absolute dismissal of the idea. It was very remarkable.
That's actually, it's funny. It's a tactic the left has perfected, which is pretending not to understand things.
Right. Well, I mean, the funny thing is, this is actually different. She's not pretending not to understand. She understands perfectly well. She's making clear she understands perfectly well what's being asked of her. Right? She's making clear, like, no, you say you give me the floor. I say I don't want the floor to say anything about this.
I am exiting the floor.
About this. I'm exiting the floor. If and when I change my mind, I will let you know. But I am not going to speak on the subject. And being polite, but indicating that's a very severe rebuke of the interviewer, being like, don't insult. That's insulting. Like, I'm not playing. I'm not your toy. But in a polite, above the fray, celebrity manner, very impressive. Well, with that, on behalf of Inez and Amber, thanks for tuning in. I'm Will Chamberlain, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.